Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this very special event, part of the International Literature Showcase programme. The International Literature Showcase is a partnership between National Centre for Writing and British Council. My name is Flo Reynolds and I'm Programme Manager at National Centre for Writing. It's my real pleasure to welcome our keynote speaker for this evening. Joy Francis is the founder and executive director of Words of Colour Productions, a creative development and communications agency for writers, artists, creatives and entrepreneurs of colour that collaborates, co-curates and co-creates with organisations and institutions that are ready to actively commit to systemic transformation programmes that inspire and facilitate inclusion, action and social impact. Joy's diverse career covers journalism, policy development, academia, literature, digital enterprise, curation, production, film, PR and creative entrepreneurship, both here in the UK and abroad. She is co-founder and lead of Digital Women UK, co-founder and co-director of the award-winning Synergy Collaborative Centre and a long-standing campaigner on mental health, well-being and inclusion in media and publishing. We are hugely honoured that Joy will give tonight's keynote speech on the topic of recovery and reimagining the literature sector. After the speech, Joy will be interviewed by journalist and author Chitra Ramaswamy. Chitra's first book, Expecting: The Inner Life of Pregnancy, won the Saltire First Book of the Year award and was shortlisted for the Polari Prize. She has contributed essays to Antlers of Water, Nasty Women, The Freedom Papers, The Bible and Message from the Skies. She's a features writer and TV critic for The Guardian, is the restaurant critic for The Times Scottish edition, a columnist for the National Trust for Scotland and broadcasts regularly on BBC Radio Scotland. Her second book will be published by Canongate in 2022. Our very special thanks go to Arts Council England, the British Council and Creative Scotland, without whom this event and the International Literature Showcase programme would not have been possible. And tonight's event is just one part of an exciting week of writer showcasing, new commissions and headline events. We hope you'll join us across the week in hearing from compelling writers and those at the forefront of best practice in the global literature sector. For full details, please look at nationalcentreforwriting.org.uk/ILS. I hope you enjoy the event, and without further ado, I'm delighted to hand over to Joy Francis and Chitra Ramaswamy.
Hello, well, thank you so much, Flo, for that wonderful introduction. And welcome everyone. Hello, my name is Joy Francis and I'm in a perpetual state of recovery, but more on that later. When the National Writing Centre sent me the title of this keynote, Recovery and Reimagining the Literature Sector, I smiled and grimaced simultaneously. I smiled because reimagining the literature sector is what I, as a black woman, operating at many intersections and as a creative, a writer, a creative entrepreneur and a spiritual being, is it unique to me. I am following in the footsteps of many before me, spanning centuries who have reimagined from the fringes and usually from a place of exclusion. Verna Wilkins, Margaret Busby, Rosemary Hudson, Elise Dilsworth and Alison Morrison, who developed and established the Diversity in Publishing Network, Centerprise in Hackney, which is no more, CLR James, Dorothea Smart and Khadija George, Stuart Hall, New Beacon Books and many, many more. My grimace is rooted in a familiar pain, part of a body memory that retains the emotion of falling from the high of reimagining after being punctured by the sharp reality of rejection or resistance or failure, when the reimagined vision isn't met, valued or respected. After landing hard, you either take the time to recover, to reimagine once again, or you don't. Disillusionment is a common condition of an unrealised reimagining. If we choose to re-engage with reimagining the literature sector, we are still faced with a problematic and complex reality. Like Groundhog Day, we are still having the same debates, we are still calling for the same changes to be made, and we are still waiting for the penny to drop. I am, of course, talking about racism, oppression, discrimination, inequality and inequity, and opaqueness. That was the reality before COVID-19 and its exacerbation of pre-existing inequalities, before the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis on the 25th of May 2020, and before the Black Lives Matter's worldwide protests. In a piece I wrote just over a year ago entitled Black Lives Matter, The Lessons That Fail to Be Learned, I said, why has it taken Black Lives Matter global protests during a pandemic to generate hand-wringing and symbolic statements of support from corporations to heritage and artistic institutions about their commitment to us? Why did it have to inspire the hashtag Publishing Paid Me to highlight the stark difference in the fiscal value placed on white compared to black writers? And why has it given black writers and artists the confidence to now reveal a litany of mistreatment by publishers, agents, or film distributors after years of bearing the burden in secret? What is undeniable is that many corporate institutions and creative industries who have declared their commitment to Black Lives Matter are among those who only 2 weeks previous would have said they were already doing enough, that our stories were too niche, that quality black writers were hard to find, or that it would take time for change to happen. I would say 400 years is long enough to understand how structural racism, white privilege, and paternalism works. I am, of course, outlining the performative versus the authentic, as has been highlighted today in The Guardian about the Barbican who produced an action plan last year, but 100 staff in a book allege that the culture organisation is institutionally racist. A light was also shed on a broader platform of inequalities in publishing with industry-focused campaigns which generated their own hashtags. Book Job Transparency hashtag, a campaign for inclusive recruitment practices in the UK publishing industry. Name the Translator hashtag, which tackles the erasure of translators, including them not being credited publicly, and Pictures means business, again about attribution and payment equality. As I keep saying, you wouldn't know this, but in my spaces, where racism exists, other isms are keeping it company. So racial justice and racial healing models are essential. Home truths. So, why do we have to reimagine so hard and recover so regularly? I'm going to stick with the reality of racism to answer this question. In 2018, the Synergy Collaborative Centre, a partnership between the University of Manchester, the University of Oxford and Words of Colour Productions, produced a well-received briefing paper entitled The Impact of Racism on Mental Health. The paper reveals a growing body of robust evidence demonstrating that racism leads to mental illnesses, especially depression, and prolonged periods of adjustment, such as extended grief. It also states that there is evidence that racism also has an effect on physical health, for example, high blood pressure. This includes situations where there is an awareness of being treated and responded to in a less than fair way on the basis of race, perhaps even being feared, avoided, or especially disadvantaged. There is a tendency to act as if racism exists without racists, which is often the elephant in the room, and shows that despite research, creative offerings, speeches, diversity reports and policies, there is still a literacy and moral deficit on the matter. Julie Birchall will get very little airtime from me, but her name alone is indicative of the problem. That there are white people who feel that they are above reproach and criticism and revel in their privilege and disgraceful behaviour, aided by newspapers and publishers. Her lost book deal was swiftly replaced by another publisher. Performative. The Sewell Report, I hear you cry. The backdrop, the instigators, a hostile government, and the curation process indicate that they are drawing from the same contaminated well. Since 2004, 3 independently funded studies into the lack of diversity in publishing have been produced. None of them have been funded by the very industry that needs to transform, and I have in some way been connected to each one. First up, In Full Colour by Danusha Keem and published in March 2004 by the Bookseller and Arts Council England, which challenged publishing's perception of itself as the bastion of liberal values. Next up, 11 years later, was Writing the Future, Black and Asian Writers and Publishers in the UK Marketplace. Initiated by myself and Courtier Newland, commissioned by Spread the Word, funded by ACE and written, yes, by Danusha Keane and Mel Larson, it reveals that the number of Black and minoritized agents and editors in publishing was significantly lower than the previous 10 years, with most large publishers estimating 8% as a level of ethnic representation in the industry at that time. Literary festivals were also put on notice. Of the 3 big festivals, Edinburgh, Cheltenham and Hay, only 4% of the 2,000 plus authors who featured in 2014 were UK Black and Asian writers of all genres, with just 1% of those being UK-based writers of adult fiction. In June 2020 came Rethinking Diversity in Publishing, the first in-depth study in the UK on diversity in trade fiction, authored by Dr. Onamik Saha and Dr. Sandra Van Lenter, published in partnership with Spread the Word and The Bookseller. The report found that assumptions about audiences being white and middle class still prevail, that publishers continue to see writers of colour as a commercial risk, and that Black, minoritized and working class audiences are undervalued by publishers economically and culturally, impacting on acquisition, promotion, and the selling of writers of colour, while agents got a rough ride in the report as the primary gatekeepers. Also in June 2020, we saw the launch of the Black Writers Guild, led by Nels Abbey, Charmaine Lovegrove and Afua Hirsch, calling on all major publishing houses in the UK to introduce sweeping reforms to make the overwhelmingly white industry more inclusive at all levels. A study by Dr. Dave Coates and Sandeep Parmar, commissioned by the Centre for New and International Writing at the University of Liverpool, highlighted a stark lack of diversity within poetry and publishing, and particularly poetry criticism. In between, there is the work of Dr. Melanie Ramdarshan Bold, Speaking Volumes, and the Book Trust on the woeful underrepresentation of writers and illustrators of colour in the world of children's publishing, and much of this is mirrored in the theatre sector. In relation to the 3 pieces of research that has been done on the publishing sector, it isn't a good look to offer publishers a roadmap for change funded by others with so little progress. A writer would have been dropped by now. All that said, there are a multitude of examples of good practice that exists, and many of it is inspired and generated and being created outside of the literature sector. From my experience, I'm 55 and I've been operating in this and many complementary spaces since the 90s. There has been and continues to be an inability to retain talent, especially of colour, within the sector, or more bluntly within institutions, because obviously the literature sector is very diverse but is also fragmented. Those who end up leaving with the talent to set up their own enterprises independently have left because their reimagining cannot thrive in these spaces. So they leave to carve out an alternative path to manifest their visions. This has been enhanced by digital platforms in terms of reach and economies of scale, though I do appreciate the digital divide does exist. These examples that I plan to refer to are underpinned and propelled by many C's, which reflect how we at Words of Colour and I work, and allow for the creation of interconnected ecosystems that inform, support and inspire each other, and produce creative alternative spaces for us to thrive. So, one of the C's, I'll start listing them now. Conversations, which are action focused, especially in the current space with white allies. Cross-fertilization, especially with academics, scientists and entrepreneurship specialists, are happening. Compassion, being present and honoured in our approach and the reframing of language, and compassion towards ourselves. Creative well-being as a right, not a privilege. Collaboration at all levels in a non-hierarchical and inspirational way. Care of ourselves and of others. courage to speak our truth and to call out what is left to hang and fester in spaces without responsibility and accountability. Confidence to say no and to say yes without being pressured to go against your integrity. Clarity to help minimize misunderstandings, time wasting, and a lack of commitment. Creative entrepreneurship, which will allow us to flourish, be independent and interdependent, and have sustainable careers. A word that's bandied about often is innovation. And I remember, at the launch of Rethinking Diversity in Publishing and, Words of Colour, we curated a week-long launch, looking at all aspects in terms of the pipeline and what needs to change. A common theme was that in publishing, for example, that innovation wasn't happening within the sector. And I agree with that position. And obviously, it takes a great deal for something to be innovative. So I'm not saying that this is an easy benchmark or standard to reach. But a lot of the true innovation in terms of creative inclusion appears to be generated and driven from outside the sector or, independently of the sector. Yes, there is interconnection, but in terms of the source, I'm going to stick to my guns on that. These innovations may catch the eye of or be brought to the sector's attention. And based on the past year, there have been numerous transactional attempts to be part of the transformation process without effort or investment in the wake of the Black Lives Matter protests and George Floyd. When I started out on this journey, Susan Yearwood was the only black agent I was aware of, followed not long after by Elise Dillsworth. Now I can put up two hands and count an agent of colour on each finger, from the Good Literary Agency to Emma Patterson. Things are slowly moving in the right direction. Despite the continued trauma of the pandemic, the loss and continued losses, it has also inspired bigger and braver thinking. Suzanne Lynn Cook, our Director of Creative Wellbeing and People, and I have been talking to literature organisations who are ready to be anti-oppressive and anti-racist organisations. Language ripe with promise, with long roots in the 1970s, or to the 1970s. There are many, many examples of meaningful change, impact, diversification and innovation happening. My list is long, so I will mention some by name for you to follow up in your own time, and others in a bit more detail. And even hearing myself say that feels exciting. So, prizes is a big part of the literature landscape and awards. And I mentioned before diversification. And so under that heading, we've got Professor Sunny Singh, co-founder with Nikesh Shukla of the Jalak Prize for British-based and British writers of colour. It's now in its 5th year, which nearly didn't happen. And this year saw the inaugural Jalak Children's and Young Adults Prize, which is brilliant, along with the Jalak Artists in Residence. Again, independently of the sector. Sunny explains that the Jalak Prize exists specifically in response to these marginalisations, diminishments and exclusions which impact on the overall well-being and mental health of writers of colour. Writers of colour are typically paid significantly less in advances and royalties, even by major publishing houses, leading to greater precarity of income and personal life than our white peers." End quote. Own It London, Crystal Mayhew Morgan and her husband Jason Morgan run a literary, film and TV agency, which is Own It London. And they host events and festivals with a strong literature focus. And again, it's evolved, particularly in the last year, and to enable a diverse range of writers to have their voices and work out in the world and have careers beyond the page by negotiating TV rights alongside being a publisher. And they've done that incredibly successfully. Own It has just announced a deal with HarperCollins Children's Books, executive publisher and fiction publisher, who've acquired world rights to 3 books. And they involve the authors of Slay in Your Lane. Now, in terms of heritage and legacy, Samanoir Secheur, who has founded the Museum of Colour And with support from Melanie Abrahams from Renaissance One and Words of Colour, Salmon Wire is leading on the creation of multi-digital galleries tracking and honouring the legacies in different literature traditions of writers of colour, with heritage organisations who, through collaboration, will rethink and reframe their archives and will identify a number of writers past and present to research, exhibit, film and co-curate performances with. In the field of independent publishing, there's multiple award-winning Jacaranda Books 20 in 2020 initiative, a historical event which we partnered on. The first time a UK publisher published 20 titles by 20 Black British writers in 1 year. And bearing in mind we had a pandemic and we're in a pandemic, that's no small achievement. Covering fiction, non-fiction and poetry, 20 in 2020 aims to normalise the presence of diverse literature and to amplify the voice of Black Britons as being of value to British culture and to society. Now, creative wellbeing was also a part of that whole initiative, and collaborations included with Foyles, Audible and the London Library. Many of the books have won awards. For example, Bad Love by Mame Blue has just won the Betty Trask Award 2021, and Lote by Scholla van Reinhold has won the Republic of Consciousness Prize for Small Presses. Now, some of you may have been aware of last year Inclusive Indies, which is a crowdfunder arranged by Knights of and Jacaranda Books, which raised over £100,000, a figure that they also acknowledge was raised after the murder of George Floyd. Now, the fund was launched beforehand, but the key thing is that fund, which they initiated off their own back when they were also under threat, the fund was administered by Spread the Word, and 10 grants were allocated to independent, diverse-led or inclusive presses in the UK. Another C that I mentioned was cross-fertilisation, but also cross-sector collaboration. So at the moment, we're involved with something called The Green Room, which is a play actually on the publishing industry, on diversity and writers and the awards system. And that's a partnership between UCL, Theatre Peckham, us, with support from the hospitality sector, the ministry, actors, book lovers, and the next generation of young producers and writers. So the play has been written by 2 Black authors, Arenison Akoji and Yvette Edwards, and it's their first play. And like I said before, it's about diversity and the publishing industry, and it's produced by Alex Wheatle, and it will also serve as a fundraiser for Theatre Peckham, and it will engage young people who want careers in theatre. So that is happening on the 4th of July at 6 o'clock, so please tune in. And we're looking for it to have a life beyond that. So it's not just a play, it is there to inspire change within the sector itself. Another thing to come up, I'd say, and also in key part in terms of reimagining, is around the funding structures of the literature sector. And funders like the Obsidian Foundation has put out calls and has spoken to a range of creators and artists to connect well-being and mental health to the participation in the arts. And they brought out a report called Creatively Minded and Ethnically Diverse, which features a range of eclectic voices across different sectors, including writing and the arts, based on conversations and consultations around what is the best way to fund in this space that is inclusive, that inspires creativity, and then doesn't put the fear of everything into writers, because we know that with the Arts Council England, for example, that a lot of writers of colour don't apply, and that's been a long-standing issue, and that's still the case. So the fact that they're leading the way, and one of the independent funders to lead the way for them to be more inclusive, is something that is key to the sector reframing itself and being much more accessible. In terms of universities and research, we now have ended up with way more. We had university partners, but over the past year we have a significant number. I think we have around 12 in total now. And the good thing about those engagement, because now at the moment there's so many surveys and a lot of research that's going on, but at the heart of that is storytelling. And the heart of that is, how do we capture the experiences that are happening to especially racialized minorities during this time. So in terms of cross-sector collaboration, especially at this time, universities and research, a lot of it into COVID-19 and the impact of the lockdowns, all three, has led to much more innovative ways of conducting research and new science, and has led to partnerships in ways to access our stories. And even the Evidence for Equality National Survey, which is led by the Centre on the Dynamics of Ethnicity at the University of Manchester in partnership with the University of St Andrews and the University of Sussex, is leading on the most comprehensive and the first of its kind study and survey into the experiences of ethnic and religious minorities in the UK at this time. And it covers everything in terms of how you self-identify, in terms of policing. But the most important thing about it is allows you to tell your story. So that way the evidence is more rooted in lived experience. And just in terms of how it's been marketed, how we've reached out to people, we've drawn on literature and creative responses. So for example, Poetic License, which was where we had 4 poets, Nick Makoa, Mumtaza May, Derek Owusu and Tolu Agbelusi, who created responses to some of the questions around the impact of Black Lives Matter and George Floyd on their lives as artists, as Black people. And what came out of that has sparked off debates in different sectors. So you use literature, but you use real life stories to help inform the research that's being done. And I think, again, just with those dismantling of certain barriers about what forms literature, the spaces in which you can operate, and that diversification, I think, is incredibly important. And that's also evident in the Synergy Collaborative Centre, which is a 5-year initiative with a particular focus on severe mental illness, but understanding that we need to use creative responses to get the lived experiences out to, for example, policymakers, and literature in its many forms is another way in which the centre is using those approaches to make the difference. An important part of all of this is intersectionality and LGBTQ plus experiences is key, because their voices, and particularly of colour, is really heard in these spaces and in literature. Girl, Woman, Other, and by Bernadette Evaristo deals with that incredibly eloquently. But in terms of initiatives and projects that are happening now, Superbia, which is a Black queer book club which is based in Manchester, is also drawn attention to the need for more queer reviewers of colour. Also Blackout UK, which is an organisation that supports and champions the experiences of Black queer men in the UK, launched Breathe 846, a project on racial justice and racial healing using creative methods, and that drew in literature, film and other creative forms with a particular focus on mental well-being. And we also have Gay Inc., led by Troy Fairclough, which again, someone who decided, I can't tell you the last time I've seen the experiences of Black gay men in the UK represented in literature, and he's got a background in theatre, and now he has this amazing organisation and writing programme for emerging black gay writers, and we're in talks in relation to creating platforms to not just encourage other black men who identify as gay or queer to share their stories, but also to look at how we heal and how we discuss and use literature to share and explore trauma. Now, in terms of creative well-being, that understandably, in terms of what we are still going through, and bearing in mind that the title talks about recovery, and I think it's far too early to talk about recovery, and I'll say a bit more about that later on. The Obsidian Foundation was founded by award-winning poet Nick Makoa, and is a one-week retreat for black poets of African descent who are selected by application, and they are there to advance their writing practice, led by 5 black acclaimed tutors. Now, the Foundation's intention is to create a community of black creative diversity where poets are fully self-expressed, free from racism. Then you have Suzanne Alien, who's the originator of Neurology of Power, an active research project asking where power resides in the brain and body and how that knowledge impacts our daily professional and personal lives, including our creative lives. And she's collaborated with Free Word and Art Cry Festival. Now, when we first went into lockdown in March 2020, we decided to do a creative response to COVID-19 for writers and creators of colour. We turned it around, ran it for 4 months. We drew on all our collaborators, our associates, and it touched on mental health, financial solvency and sustainability, well-being, entrepreneurship, system design thinking. Even though it was for writers of colour and creatives in the UK, we had diverse cohorts from Venezuela, Ecuador, Peru, Dubai, and some of them are originally from Britain. And just being able to create digital holistic spaces. And we also have therapists and counsellors who are members of the team who created safe spaces for group sessions and one-to-ones. And that's thrown up so much for us, and that has been inspired and only could happen because of our 3-year planning process for the Creative Wellbeing Hub, which we created with yogis, with therapists who also are writers, but they operate on different platforms, to think about creating tailored programs and activities and holistic spaces on and offline for recovery, while being able to access a creative wellbeing audit, which was developed by Suzanne Lynn Cook, on how to be whole and create authentically and freely as a minority or an outsider in spaces, sometimes hostile, and to be in a position to create opportunities to share the learning from different sectors for a more holistic and sustainable outcome. So those are just like some examples, and hopefully that didn't sound too much like a list, because obviously I could give you a case study, but I just want to give hope and to indicate just how much is happening and will continue to happen, as always happened. And just in the midst of the difficulties, the trauma, the losses that we've experienced, there is also transformation, there is continued reimagining, and there is recovery of sorts. So what now? Reimagining happens because the current reality continues to be disappointing, and recovery can only be a myth or consigned to the past if the picture changes. My perpetual recovery isn't a problem. It's a sign that I'm taking risks, I'm growing, and reflects the reality of the space and spaces that we operate in. Recovery is earned, not given. So the question posed for this speech needs to be answered by the sector itself, as the purpose of reimagining and recovery is to transform. So what are you doing to transform the sector that you are part of? One thing is abundantly clear. We should use this unique, surreal and unique time to map the literature sector, as there are too many assumptions and presumptions based on the past. It seems to be fragmented, and an excavation is needed. All too often, it's those of us on the receiving end of oppression that end up making the changes or calling for the changes we want to need to see. So who is and who will be doing the reimagining and recovery? How transparent will it be? Who values this process and who doesn't? Are we in mind? And will the reimagining and recovery that takes place fit and reflect our experiences? What COVID, Black Lives Matter and George Floyd have amplified is that we can do nothing but reimagine, recreate, reframe and collaborate and resist while we disrupt, campaign and challenge. I will continue to build ecosystems, create spaces for reimagining and to inspire others to believe there is a space for them, their stories and who they are in totality in the literature world. If the space isn't there for them, we will encourage them to create their own. Thank you.
Joy, thank you so much for that wonderful keynote. It was absolutely stuffed with material for us to discuss. So I think I'd like to just go in right at the start to begin with, Joy, because you began by saying that, you know, you see yourself as being in a perpetual state of recovery. And I thought that's such a brilliant way to begin. And perhaps you could just say a little bit more about that to begin with.
Yeah, I thought about it. You know, we always are led to believe that we have to be sound, we have to be together. And a recovery, there is something about it that suggests a negative experience. And actually, I think that it is a sign of self-awareness. I think it is a sign of responsibility. And I think that it's also a sign of accountability to yourself. Because when you think about where that term is used, it's you know, linked to addiction. And in some ways, you know, you could say that we're a glutton for punishment, because why stay in a space and operate in spaces or try and get the attention of spaces that don't seem to want you, you know, or doesn't hear you. And I think that's why so much happens outside of the space, because to recover, you need space. And I think sometimes that a lot of institutions that say they're creative don't allow that space to happen. So as a result, they lose good people. So I think that, right, I think so. Because I think and I think why there's so much creativity at the moment, because despite what's going on, I'm having so many meetings, I'm having so many conversations. I don't know how I'm able to hold all of that, because they are focused, they are inspired, they're authentic, they're coming from a place of vulnerability. They're mid-recovery, post-recovery, and we're all supporting each other. And so I'm proud to say, recovery, because it indicates that I have taken a risk, that I am being more vulnerable, and that every time I come back, I'm stronger, more informed, more braver. And that means I actually reach more people. Whereas I think if you don't allow yourself to recover, you remain small, scared, less sure. And then as a result of that, your creativity can't flourish, and you then don't express your full self and authenticity. So I think part of it for me is around creating the spaces for us to reframe, because I think a lot of it is the language as well. A language does not allow compassion. It doesn't allow you to be vulnerable. It doesn't allow you to say, you know what, I've changed my mind. I don't think that's going to work. So I've had to learn all those things. And so I think that's where, because only from doing this that I came up with, I thought actually, I was writing it, and I thought, to be honest, that I'm still recovering, and that's okay.
I think the thing that your keynote made me think about and sort of realize as well, which I think is a kind of pitfall of a lot of these discussions, is assuming that we're already in a place that we haven't even got close to yet. And you talked very persuasively and eloquently in your keynote, Joy, about this notion of we ain't there yet, you know, and I think that recovery almost kind of suggests that we've reached a point where we are ready to begin recovering, and actually we are so early on in the process. We've barely started speaking or being given the space to speak yet.
I totally agree, and that upsets me. And I think that it really felt, I don't know about you, but I felt last year, in March, when George Floyd was still around with his family, living his life, that there was an opportunity here, you know, for us to think and reset. And there was a much stronger sense of compassion last year, I felt, with the first lockdown. You know, you went out, there wasn't cars on the road, how we were, fair enough, you know, it was still a place of uncertainty. I think that was the thing, there was such a place of uncertainty. And, you know, I was looking at people, are you okay? You know, it was a whole different energy. And then since now the third lockdown, I think a year on, and I think people are really optimistic about this year, that went out the window very quickly, just in terms of how we would move and navigate through the world. And it's like now, it's like furlough or excessive working, deadlines, or there is a freneticness, a franticness, which to me comes from a lack of time for recovery and a lack of acknowledgement of how deep this goes, and that actually people have done, amidst everything, there has been lots of developments, and it's like it's not giving us space to think. And I can see, you know, on the feeds from a lot of literature leaders and others, you know, and those outside the space, but who are passionate about literature, are saying, you know, we need to stop. I'm burnt out. That's what I'm hearing. I'm burnt out. I'm like, this is not. So that words are telling you, you can't even recover, and yet we're told to get over it. We're told that we need to recover. We have to actually understand and respect that word and know what it means, and give people the time, because I think that you can't leapfrog the process. That's why we keep having these debates. You can't leapfrog. You have to go through the steps. And going back to the whole thing around, you know, the heading of addictions, that there are steps you have to go through. And this is no different. And like you say, you know, we don't know where we are yet. You know, we're just waking up every morning. We don't know what time of the day it is. I now say my age more often because that's the only thing I know with numbers, because I don't know if it's a Monday, if it's 5 o'clock or whatever. You know, and I think we are working harder, and I think there's an expectation, because I think there's a culture where it's like you're at home. So in a way, and you're not traveling, you should be like, hang on a minute, you know, we are working through something that kills people. That's not a little thing. We need to give each other permission to be kinder and more patient. Because even literature would struggle. You know, a lot of writers have struggled at this time, you know, because of all the additional pressures. I just think that, so those are, like you say, those are just some of the reasons from my point of view why, let's not get ahead of ourselves, really. There needs to be a whole new language within the literature sector of how we speak, because ultimately, for example, publishing is a commercial enterprise. And I think that there is a misunderstanding, as if that you have to look for and be meeting deadlines and work in a particular way to be financially successful. And I just think that if people feel respected and are happy, and there's transparency, and we're seeing it, because look, people are being productive and they're not under the watchful eye of line managers.
Yeah, and I think one of to me, the kind of the central thrust of your keynote was very much about this idea of all of the positive changes that are happening in the industry as a result of this, catastrophic time. And that is not in any way an overstatement how difficult the last year has been on every single level. What you seem to be really saying, and it's powerful, is that all the change that's happening is happening on the fringes. It's not happening in the mainstream, the so-called mainstream, the gatekeepers, the cultural gatekeepers, the people with the power. They aren't really doing anything. And I wonder if you could speak a bit more about that, Joy, and your position and your work, because you work across a lot of sectors, and that must be incredibly frustrating to see, everyone's talking the talk, but it's the kind of paying of lip service, isn't it? The change, and meanwhile, the term diversity wears ever thinner. People get more and more fed up of it, and actually nothing's really changing.
It's funny, I didn't use the word, I'm amazed, I didn't use the word mainstream once in my keynote, and I just got to be really, really clear, trying to use new language as well, really, really clear, because I think this is part of the problem about the literature sector, because I'm saying that broadly, but I'm really, in my mind, and I want to, because I know there's people who be thinking, well, hang on, I'm in the sector and we're doing things and we're working with them. And that's why I was very clear to say about the fact that there are engagements. We have, spread the word has come up a lot. Ruth Harrison, Becky Swain at Manchester Poetry Library. We have a lot of allies, and there's a lot of literature organizations, but a lot of them are NPOs, and they have to rely on funding. But my point is, and I don't want that to get lost, and anyone, please don't email me or put undue comments that are misplaced in the comment section. What I'm saying is, a lot of the time, most of the innovative and transformative ideas are held outside of the sector, and even if they are held within the institutions and the bricks and mortar, those people have to take those ideas with them and leave. Crystal worked within mainstream publishing. She had to leave. Look what she's doing now with Own It. There's many others who have done that. Even in terms of Jacaranda, I think half their team were people who were high flyers. Amy Falone, who set up Nights Of and Roundtable Books, co-founded it. She was with a publisher. She's young, and then she had to take her reimagining with her, and that's my point. My point is that if you track the lineage, the line, the roots to a lot of the most impactful, and the context for me is in relation to intersectionality, people and artists of colour. That's colour. I'm framing it in that way. And so it's even more pronounced as far as I'm concerned, because all the people I've mentioned are of colour or want to work to be inclusive. It's not, because if so, I wouldn't be as busy. My team wouldn't be as busy. And you wouldn't have Nick setting up, who are writing. You wouldn't have you wouldn't have Nikesh and Nick setting up the Good Literary Agency and Obsidian, respectively, while they're trying to write their books and mentoring and everything else. And, Nikesh and I have spoken about this at the Rethinking, Diversity in Publishing launch. All those things are happening. Where they're happening outside the industry. And then you have to find the investment. And that's why I said one of my C's collaboration. So collaborating with organisations like Speaking, Book Trust represents, with Speaking Volumes, with Common Word and others, and a lot of them are on the fringes. And yes, it may get funded, but this is, and it's even more pronounced now, And you think we're not having access to research telling us where we're failing. Roadmaps have been created for all these institutions that are way significantly more funding than we will ever be, and yet. So, so that for me, that's why, please tell us, how are you reimagining? And also, if they're doing great stuff, let us know. Let us know more consistently. Be less opaque, so that we all know what we're doing and we're not all reinventing the wheel. And why I said about the transactional side of things, I cannot believe organizations, commissioning editors who I've never heard of were all contacting us, but the way they were contacting us, and I had to hold myself and not swear, was so presumptive. And it's like, their job title is their job title is to find the talent. And then we're approached with no budget, but with an expectation we're just going to hand over all these people and names. Do you see what I mean? And that's like, you've not learnt anything. And there's loads of people out there who had those stories. Alongside that were others who, I would say, because I'm a hip hop head, who came correct. And then said, look, we want to have, because we're really relational, we want to have a conversation. Not a problem. So I think that, so that's where I'm coming from in terms of the genesis of these things. And a lot of the time, sometimes what happens, you've seen people build their audiences online and everything else, and then you have a publisher or a Netflix or something that says, we want you because you've done all the hard work already. Mm-hmm. You've already shown that you've grown your audiences, you've done the work.
You've taken the risk.
And then they get a deal.
Yeah.
Yes. And that's why the digital, I'm sorry, but there's, again, so that's part of that narrative too. Yeah. And we've got to be honest about that.
Yeah. So I wonder, Joy, whether we could do almost like a little bit of a temperature check of, where you think we were sort of pre-COVID-19, and, what for you has improved in these kind of, 12 to 15 months since, and what things we're really stagnating on.
It's so difficult to say, to be honest. You know why? And that's why I mentioned about the importance of, we need to map the sector, especially after this, and especially after all the statements from last year, about what they're going to do in relation to being anti-racist. And so I think, from my point of view, I think it'd be disingenuous of me to respond to that in a way, because what's happened, and I hope I was alluding to, we've been engaging with so many new partners, a lot of academic partners, brokering things, curating, co-producing. So we're just not only operating in the literature space. So what I'm aware of is what's happening outside of it, because that's what's more transparent. And so the only guide really is what, the sort of more, less institution, but more of the sort of campaigning activist organisations, what they're doing. And obviously this is a year on, more or less, from actually this month, from Rethinking Diversity's launch. So this actually, you'd think that the publishers would say, look, a year on from the report, which many of them said, look, bang to rights, you'd be thinking, okay, right, year on, this is what we're doing. So I think that it's harder to say, and I think that's why I think we need to hand over to them. It needs to be mapped. Mm-hmm. There needs to be some sort of mapping process with real key indicators about what has happened, what has improved. I mean, I've seen, like things like HarperCollins and Penguin, where they are now, because it's funny, because like I said, but again, it's like following, because, I'm not saying it wasn't on the table for ages, but, after Jacaranda publishing 20 black authors, British writers, and now you're starting to see more writers of colour being published by particular publishers. So that's great, but within the because that's, to me, what you need to be doing anyway. But in terms of the culture, in terms of that, what was said quite, starkly last year around the fact that the white middle class reader is what is pursued. So that's not going to change in a year, is it? So how has that been reimagined? How has the black reader, Asian reader been reimagined? I mean, Bernardine Evaristo has spoken about that, So those are things, actually, I think we're in a space now where, yeah, we're seeing things, but we don't know how much of it is performative or authentic. So I think really it would be great as part of the recovery, and to enable us to reimagine a different literature sector, that we actually need them to come out and say, this is what we're doing, this is what we need to do, this is how we want to collaborate, because I don't think that lends itself necessarily readily and easily to some of the bigger players in the space. So yeah, and the terms of engagement, what are they? So I don't know who's going to lead that, because I think that's the thing. Where's the leadership in the sector? Who's leading? Don't know. So you just have the individual pockets of individuals, like National Theatre or Kiln Theatre, that are doing amazing stuff with Indu Rubasingham and others who are making themselves known. This is what we're doing. But it's very individualised. So,
and that notion of the reimagining that is happening and all the exciting things, and I think it's important and it's valuable to recognise all of the great stuff that is going on.
Yeah.
But when the big players, as you refer to them, are seeing this, are you finding that you're meeting a kind of resistance or a willingness to kind of join in with the reimagining? To what extent are they like, we'll bring it in, like the Netflix model.
Yes.
You go off, do all of the work, we won't give you any support, but if we watch it becoming successful, then we'll take it. How much resistance are you finding there, and how much is there a genuine willingness,
to be honest,
in the pandemic to take this stuff on and to take along that notion that you were saying in your keynote as well of home truths, taking a long, hard look at oneself in the industry? Okay.
What I said, and I made public when I was curating and chairing some of the events for the key events and talks with for Rethinking Diversity last year, I said this is the third report. I was involved in chairing the event at the Barbican with In Full Colour when it came out, involved in Writing the Future, and involved with Rethinking Diversity. They find me, and then but I was really clear. I said, look, there is nothing more I can say or do. Everything, the ball, the pitch, the referee, the players are in their court now. And to be honest, that's not where my focus is. My focus isn't. I haven't got the time, and there's other priorities, and I think there's other people. My priority is developing alternatives, working with that, inspiring and help facilitate mentoring and creating programs to not just show that there is a home for you, we want your stories, and encouraging them and signposting and brokering, but also the creative well-being piece is my passion at the moment, to ensure that wherever they go in the world, they can hold their own, be well, and not disappear and not be a casualty. I think that so that's my answer, really, that I think there's too much attention that is given in a way really that it should be the other way around. And I've always had that quite ambivalent relationship with publishers anyway, which is why I work so well with indies. I have worked with mainstream publishers as well, and they come to us and everything else, but because we're independent, we negotiate, we talk in a way that it's not fear-based. Oh, will this or won't this happen? No. And I think that from my point of view, the writers are what has always and will always be our priority. The stories will always be our priority. And those who are very clear about how they want to engage, and they tell us what their vision is. So you can get excited and add to it. That's what collaboration and cross-fertilization, all that is about. It's a creative process rather than transactional. And that's what I hear about feeling that it's transactional, performative. That's coming up a lot at the moment. And I think people expect more. I think that whoever the literature sector leaders or innovators are, please stand up and let us know who you are. And don't just come when you want something, because it cheapens the whole process. It does. I think, and that's not all of them, because there's some great, people at Hachette and others. I know writers having amazing experiences with some of the, imprints. I mean, Dialogue Books is doing brilliant stuff, but even Charmaine Lovegrove has co-founded the Black Writers Guild, and she's in the industry.
Yeah. And I guess this kind of feeds back into, well, the smile and the grimace, even when you're asked to do something like this, and I'm asked to interview you afterwards. Inherent in that is a kind of, what should we be doing? What should you be doing? From what you're saying and from your keynote, the message really is, it's you've said it, you've walked it, you've talked it, and other people need to start doing the work. We haven't got much time left, Joy, but I wondered whether we could talk very specifically and briefly about Black Lives Matter and how you saw that impacting on publishing and literature, because there was this kind of groundswell, wasn't there, of people committing to doing the work of anti-racism, and sales of certain kinds of books went through the roof, but then on the other hand there was the sense of it being a hollow gesture and it not being meaningful and it not really leading to effective change. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about that.
Well, what firstly was I love that. Briefly and specifically, Chitra, you're such a journalist. Takes one to recognise one. You're so funny. There's two things, and it's funny because there's a quote that I didn't mention in my speech, and I'm going to mention it shortly. I think it will partly answer your question. I think the first thing that struck me was, yet again, Black Lives Matter has been going for a good while. And it's like, this is a new thing.
Yeah.
And if we remember before, it was being vilified, almost like borderline terrorist organisation, how it was treated. People, lest we forget, And then everyone was mobilised. So they can speak to reimagining. And the fact that we now have a UK-based Black Lives Matter organisation, I mean, that's showing you just, I think there's a before and after picture, and it's very, very clear about people who was consigned to literally a dustbin. All of a sudden now, they've always been a force to be reckoned with, but there's been a whole reframing and repositioning, which they've made the charge of. Of course, the thing is, a lot of people are blacking out, everything being black. There was a lot of gestures, there was a lot of talk, which is why you'd think a year on that I should be reading through all these manifestos about what's going to happen. Mm-hmm. Not really, so why? You made it so, why? I think that should have just come from publishers. I think in terms of mobilizing and people understanding movements, but also the fact that digital has been a liberator for many artists of color. It's very demanding, but it's been very liberating. And so I think that it's a real mark and a reference point. And what I find interesting, like I said, the organisations that we're working with now, in terms of the organisational development piece, which we sort of did, but that's coming, I'm like, well, if you're willing, you know what I mean? Let's get on with it. And a lot of it is outside the sector. We've got people who are not related. We've got a relationship with them on other projects, but they're coming to us. But also they're open to literature and creative ways of expressing the stories of, the lived experience narratives. And going back to all the books and everything else, like you're saying, I'm going to now quote Derek Owusu, who was interviewed, who was part of the Poetic License series with Evans survey. And this is perfect. He said, I'm not sure how supporting Black writers and buying their books is going to help anything. Relating obviously to all the, this uptake, like you said. I just can't make the connection in terms of us trying to get rid, for example, of police brutality, in terms of George Floyd. Maybe they feel that by reading books on race, they will these books will give them perspective. I don't think you need to read a book in order to understand that you should treat human beings like human beings. So all that reading is useless if the foundation isn't or wasn't already there. And if you feel that you need to read those books to treat people with respect and dignity, then the foundation isn't there, so you shouldn't be reading them.
That is fantastic. That says it all, really, doesn't it?
So it's funny, so I left it out. I thought in terms of time, and yet there was a home for it.
It wanted to be spoken.
Yes.
Yeah. In spite of, everything that we've discussed, some of the frustrations, and I think the word you used early on was disillusionment, and that whole sense of, the horror, really, that it took the murder, yet another murder rather, of a black man in order for us to even begin to start having this discussion in the first place. There's a lot of pain and tenderness and trauma here. Yet in spite of that, literature is obviously the place where all of this and so much more can be explored. And what continues then, Joy? I feel like this is a kind of powerful place to end, really, to kind of give you hope, really, and to sort of counter that disillusionment and pain, which is also legitimate and there.
Yeah, I mean, when I was talking about the disillusionment, I'm talking about why you end up in recovery, because you reimagine, but your vision isn't shared. And I think that creativity needs company, and also from my point of view is about legacy. So I haven't really been, to be honest, the disillusionment is me putting it out there in terms of the experiences, particularly of those who are writers, playwrights, they want to move into production. We still have a shortage of producers. Poetry producers, for example. So you end up being everything, which is why we've got a strong entrepreneurial piece. So I think that I couldn't be disillusioned and work. It wouldn't work for me. I have to be hopeful. I have to, and that's why I operate outside of the mainstream. And that was a conscious decision, because then you have the freedom, you can engage with people you need to. So all the things that I was saying about the importance of saying yes and no, and retain your integrity and compassion, I don't have to negotiate that with anyone else. I'm negotiating it for myself and my team. And I was very clear about that from my late 20s, from when I went independent at 30. I just knew, I know myself, so I know how am I going to thrive and survive, and I know that I'm here. My part of my purpose and role is around facilitation and creation and putting, the windows need to come off. Everyone needs to be able to get in, and create and leave and go and come as they please. And I think that, we are in a space where alternative models need to be shown. So I think that it's an acknowledgement that is part of the process. If anything, for me, I think it's disappointment. It's disappointment. I think disappointment, and there's disillusionment, and I think that's why some people, like I said in my speech, that not everyone. Let's not be misguided here. Not everyone recovers. Some people don't come back, and there's many writers and others who've spoken about and who we're unearthing and excavating now, who left for their own well-being. And so for me, the disillusionment is what is present, but again has been left and hasn't been explored and acknowledged, because there's people we have lost who would be, God knows where we'd be if they recovered and felt they could come back and believed in the vision they have to reimagine the sector. But they were operating at a time when we weren't having these discussions, when we didn't have the transparency to the degree that we have. That's why, from my point of view, about not being a spokesperson for what's going on in the industry or not, and because I'm not meant to be, and I don't want to be, you know. And I think that's something for me. I'm into conversations, and I'm into connections, and I'm into collaborations, you know, because we're not here for a long time, you know, and I can't. George Floyd cannot, and not on my watch, have died in vain, you know. And it's as simple as, there is no way that Black Lives Matter, but especially, you know, that seeing someone being killed in and a child filming it, you know, two friends, one of them filming it, we can't forget, you know. And I think that when things are trivialized, like, you know, a certain person whose name I'm not going to mention again, I mentioned in the speech, you know, that has to play itself out. We can't get in the way. It has to be played out. The narratives have to shift. And if we keep feeding, I'm not saying this within the industry necessarily itself, but I think in terms of the climate at the moment, if we keep feeding what doesn't deserve attention, we're not going to make progress.
Joy, I think that's a really powerful place to finish. Thank you so much. It's been a privilege
Thank
to
you.
be in conversation with you, and thank you for your keynote.
Thank you so much, Chitra.